the best I can explain it right now.
That was so cool. Thank you. I mean, that like mirrors my experience so well. Like that,
Mm.
with a little verbal tweaking, that could be like a transgender person's story about themselves, right? Like
Yeah.
cases, like
Yeah, and that's what I like about you naming gender, as an aspirational thing, because I actually think it's a way in which we can get away from the complexity of the cultural and social, implications around trans and transitioning, and just looking at it as a thing that we all share. If we can look at it, and then it makes, to me, the idea is it will make it easier for people to empathize for people who are making the transition, especially if it's back again with Rachel Hayden. Last time her and I spoke, it resulted in a 7 hour, over 3 different day conversation about the Daily Wire documentary, What is a Woman? Managed to get a clip out finally from that. There's still probably more to come, although the editing is requiring a fair bit of effort, but we'll get there. Um, but sort of seeing that as a bit of an evolution of us talking a bit about the territory or the landscape around trans culture war issues. And this finally, I hope, is us starting to zoom in and to have a discussion more about gender and some of the ideas that Rachel has, as well as some of the questions that we both have about it, and see if we can just zoom in a little bit more. And Rachel just recently did a talk with John Vervaeke and Greg Henriquez that I think I put out about a little over a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. And maybe we'll just start as sort of framing that. I'll put a link somewhere in the description too, so that might be a nice little primer. But yeah, I'm curious what uh, what you what you sort of felt you got out of that talk. I certainly appreciated. I think I reflected to you. It sort of seemed like there was three, and not differing, but three different perspectives or way to talk about gender. And I sort
mhm.
of some of this piece over here lands for me, and then John brings in something that sort of helps click, and then Greg, on sort of the psychology side, and it just seems like it fills in some gaps, or expands a little bit more this idea, rather than just one person from one perspective talking about it. So I really appreciate it from that, and it inspired a number of the things that I'd like us to talk about today. But yeah, I'm curious how it was for you, what you're left with.
Yeah, going in, I was incredibly nervous, like the whole day before, like anxious, sweating, that kind of thing. And because I didn't want to get it wrong, it's a big deal for me to go on the stage, so to speak, anytime I do, just because of culture wars issues.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I love it. I was like, this is such an opportunity with these two like people who I admire, people whose work like is so impactful on my life, and getting a chance to like actually discuss this thing that's sort of like become my own fascination, and something where I feel like I had a new take on it, so that we could like bring to this corner of the internet,
Mm-hmm.
and let people play with it in a more open fashion. Like I really wanted that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like it did happen. Like I felt halfway through the talk, like could feel my body just like relaxing, because I was like, oh, we're getting there. It's coming. It's happening, And that was probably around the same time like a dialogo started to actually emerge in our conversation as well. Like I felt it, intermittently at points after that. And John mentioned it at the end. So I feel like there was some kind of like you said, some emergent wisdom, maybe knowledge, something new, that really helped me like validate where I was coming from,
Mm-hmm.
as a
Mm-hmm.
non-scientist, to be like, here's my idea of where we could go with this, and have those two be really on board with it, but then also like questioning, provoking, challenging, adding new dimensions to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Especially John with his like, okay, but if gender is going to be aspirational, then there has to be the possibility of failure
Mm-hmm.
for it to matter, and
Yeah.
there has to be a rigor to it, and that kind of thing, without rigidity.
Mm-hmm.
So, exactly where, in retrospect, where I would have wanted it to go, even though I hadn't thought about those questions in the same way exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it occurs to me as like a really good start of of really digging into and having this complex, more nuanced conversation. Like it felt like it covered the corners of the topic, such that if anybody watches it, they can sort of get the sense of like there's this over here and there's this over here and there's this over here, and here's all the connective tissue that brings them together. And now maybe the next thing is, what do we do about that, or how do we evolve the conversation? Like what needs to come next now that we're sort of identifying these points around sort of the topic.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had another friend, a trans guy, email me and say like, that's great. It feels like it's finally opening some space. But
Yes.
you know, like like he's like, oh, I hope you like flesh it out in the next one. And I'm like, I don't know what that means exactly. Like, like we can go farther into the details of the specifics, which I think is important. But and I don't know that we will do a next one. But like what you're saying, and what John was kind of also provoking was like, okay, now that we're like looking at the ontology of gender, we also want to look at the normativity, like kind of simultaneously. And I think that made sense to me the more we talked. I think partly because I was feeling like the frustration around ontology like subsiding. Like I was like, oh, this is really satisfying. And now I can see how we need to like, look at gender, like, hopefully, beyond the culture wars, but like what it should be as well as what it is kind of simultaneously, because I think it is one of those funky transjective things that is objective and subjective at the same time. And so bridges is ought divide really, really well. It's a really good case of that happening.
I think maybe my hope for it, or sort of the idea of what's next, and maybe that happens with you and John and Greg, or maybe that's magically happens between you and I, or I love the idea of that. But I think for me, it sort of comes down to, why I developed that collective intelligence campfire, like why I created that course, the dialogos kernel course, because for me, the hope is that we can, as we start to sort of focus more on this object and get a better sense of it, any actions we take towards it are more sustainable. They are more nuanced. They are more complex. So it's almost the idea for me, it's like, what's next? It's like it occurs to me like, that's a great primer of like, this is the conversation we should be having around gender. But now it's like, can we take that framework and start actually turning it into sustainable change? And because we talked before about like the problems with some of the laws and the oversimplifications here, and gender affirming emphasis, and all the sort of downsides to that. It's like, how can we again further this, so hopefully such that the people who I don't know what we want to say, need to transition, or doing it in a cleaner, healthier, whether that's mental or physically or both sort of way. And then we're also not capturing or catching up people who maybe are just a little bit more on the confused and more on the, identity, who am I sort of end of things.
Yeah.
And they're not, getting caught up in a particular, what we tend to refer to as a social contagion, such that they end up making changes that they later regret, and we've talked about this a little bit before. Maybe people are always going to get caught up in sort of the tornado of that, and I still like the idea of minimizing
Yeah.
maximizing where it needs to be maximized and minimizing where it needs to be minimized. And I think the way that we're going about it right now isn't doing a really great job of that. So I'm hoping that this more nuanced conversation, with, like you said, opening up more space, gives us an opportunity to, when we're really talking about the way something should be culturally, I hate
Yeah.
should, but that we're
Right.
actually taking this into consideration. So, yeah, but what about this over here? If we do it this way, we're leaving a huge gap over here in this area, Yeah.
Yeah. I think that like as you're talking, I'm thinking about how, the trans issue is situated within a gender issue and then a meaning crisis issue outside of all that, and I'm hoping that all three layers of that, I mean, they would have to interact, I'm imagining,
Mhm.
um, in order to work. And like, okay, so part of the trans issue is like, okay, what happens with cis people though? Like, that's a whole wider conversation that I was hoping we could spark, with John and Greg, and then of course you and me like talking, as well. And like, understanding like, okay, do we need another, like a reinventio of gender, and that's why I would love to bring more like cis people of different stripes into this conversation, more, different non-binary, trans, whatever people as well. But I really am hoping that, like you said, that what's getting called the social contagion can be sort of dealt with appropriately, I guess. I mean, it's a tricky one, but I do see it with some of the kids I work with. Like I see
Mhm.
them thinking they're this, and then they back off from that. Oh, maybe I'm just traumatized, or whatever it is. Maybe I have
Mhm.
a meaningless life in other ways, and no friends, and so I'm
Mhm.
resorting to this. And they are really thinking about it. This isn't like a
Mm.
conservative talking point entirely.
Yeah, well, for sure. I mean, I would certainly hope that that's the case. And for those who are seeking help from others, the idea that those others can hold a broader, more complex perspective. And of course, you, I see, is definitely one of those people who can do that. And we also see examples, however cherry picked they were in the documentary, you have people who are very sort of silent or ideological or one sided about the issue, and they're not bringing in that nuance, and therefore that's going to impact the way that they're affirming or denying, or whatever that is. So
Yeah.
yeah, but I think that's maybe a great thing to sort of dive into and sort of talk a little bit about, because I've heard you name this, and it was in that conversation as well, sort of this connection of gender and aspiration. And maybe this touches a bit into, being less trans specific, but also, for cis people, it's like, what's sort of the perspective or the frame that you're holding when you think of gender as aspirational? Like how would you lay the groundwork for what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I rely heavily on Agnes Callard's work on aspiration and philosophy. And she kind of resolved this paradox, which is that, you can't basically become a different person from the perspective that you inhabit currently.
Mm-hmm.
And you can make your goals, you can make decisions, you can, evaluate your likes and dislikes based on your current worldview.
Mm-hmm.
But becoming a different person is a whole different kind of project, which she
Mm-hmm.
termed proleptic rationality, which is basically a form of rationality. We don't want to like say this is an irrational project.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, to become more rational would be irrational, or to aspire to become more rational would be irrational also.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but it's weirdly different in that it involves becoming a new person with different, values and a different worldview as well. And so she kind of resolved this paradox, you know, by saying the values of your future self are what is leading the aspirational attempt. So, while we're proceeding from present to future temporally, we're actually proceeding from future to present normatively.
Mm.
This mysterious you of the future is actually pulling the strings, so to speak, on the
Mm-hmm.
present you. And you don't really know who that is or where they are. And often you need the help of other people to guide you there. For instance, becoming like a doctor or something, like you don't know what your doctor's self will be and what their values will be. But you have medical school, teachers and other students and things like that to help guide you along that path. Um, that's kind of a really general, watered down version of her philosophy. It's really powerful to me because it spoke to my need to actualize this sense of potential in me that like kept saying like you have a female soul. That was the feeling I had, and I could say scientifically female brain or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
um, but I felt like, okay, I have a female soul, but I'm not a woman. I can't identify as a woman. Like there was like a block there in me. And I
Mm.
was like, well, it makes sense if you think aspirationally, like what is a woman? This like person who has gone through this process of adulting, basically, becoming by doing and gradually transforming into someone who could be called a woman in our society, according to our, standards, but also according to who we are biologically. So that's sort of the base model of aspiration that I often use. And I think it makes a lot of sense to a lot of people in transition when I start to talk about it, which is an interesting side note.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, I never was able to speak about it this way. People will say, just be yourself and you do you or whatever, but they don't have the language to really understand it.
Hmm. Is something about that has me want to map the idea of sort of an existential ignorance on top of this idea of aspirations, sort of the way you talk about it. And I wonder if, like, is that the block, or is that a fitting I don't know, idea or theory or map for where you felt the block? Like, I have a female soul, but there's a block, like, but I'm not a woman, whatever that is, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I didn't know what it was, right? Like like why do I feel this way? I feel this inherent femininity inwardly, but for mysterious reasons I can't claim the label woman. You know, that was my sense. And it was this existential crisis, like, well, who am I then? And what is a woman? And what is it led to what is gender, as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
because I couldn't inhabit the values of that future self. I couldn't see the world that way entirely. I
Mm.
wouldn't have said it like that at the time, but that, in retrospect.
That inspires me to sort of ask you this question, but I won't preface it. I'll ask it, and then I'll say what I mean by it. It's sort of like, well, now, do you feel like a woman? And for
Yeah.
me, I want, yes, okay, well then great. I
Well,
guess we
oh,
can.
sorry. I was saying, yeah, like the usual, like, yeah, I'm about to respond, but no, keep going.
Gotcha, gotcha. But it's not really, I don't want any part of this to sort of be that question about, transition, medical transition, being insufficient. I want to tie this back into the idea of aspiration, this idea that, perhaps you're on a journey of self-actualization that sort of involves this gender aspiration. And it's just sort of like, I can imagine what you might say just based on the way that I would think the trajectory of that would go. But, it's so much better to actually hear what your real experience is rather than my guess.
Curiosity, definitely. I would say, still on the path, uh,
Mm,
in a sense. Like, I feel like my worldview is shifting and changing. I've done a lot of work to try to kind of like set my North Star, so to speak. Um, I've done a lot of work to like build up my community, have supports, develop aspirational models, and sift through like the detritus of my life and my mind, and like what to keep, what to throw away, what do I still need. I would say that's not finished, and in some way it maybe never will be, because I was raised one way, right? I was like cultured a certain way. And so according to like a cultural model of gender, that may never be complete. Like, I still find myself behaving in like annoying ways to myself that I'm like, oh, this is such a like dude thing to do. Like, not that I would care if a dude did it necessarily.
yeah.
Sometimes I would. I'd be like, oh, this is such a like, standard like husband action to take, like leaving the
Mm.
shoes on them in the wrong place or what, you know what I mean? That kind of um that to me is of course stereotypical, but um so it seems like I'm moving closer, and I think, it's important to think about an endpoint being a possibility. I don't want to be that person that's like, well, I'm just always moving toward womanhood because, it's out there as an end goal. I don't know that that's wrong, now that I'm
Mhm.
saying it, but I also feel like if you're going to aspire to something, you don't want to, like, oh, I'm going to be a doctor. Well, I'll just always move toward being a doctor and never quite get there, like
Mm,
I'm hoping at some point I'll feel like, okay, I've like, this is close enough. This is like, I'm
mm,
there, like I can mapping my mind and my behavior. There's an interesting side note about hormones there,
mhm,
where hormones are definitely changing my emotional state to become more like a typical female,
mhm,
albeit without the full menstrual cycle
mhm,
rotation. I'm kind of working on that a little bit, but it's like, well, that's like a different layer, I guess. I mean, it depends on like, again, like what do we define as a woman? Like, is it someone with that predisposition mentally who then transitions and attains that transition,
mhm,
or do the hormones have to be part of that, or do they just help, or
mhm.
what I mean? So there could be some subcategories in that.
Well, I certainly like the idea that, it doesn't have to be, almost like, the idea of sort of spectrums and various sort of lines. And there's, I think, not every female necessarily goes through their menstrual cycle for the same period of time. And for some women, based on, you know, other underlying factors, they have extremely uncomfortable or painful periods, and a lot of women don't. And so it's just like, well, do you have to have the painful, uncomfortable period? Does that make you more of a woman because you suffered more for this thing that's uniquely, you know, to that sex, you know, with, and even then, you know, that's probably impacts, you know, your body, or that's impacted by your body's ability to produce enough progesterone or enough estrogen, depending on where in the cycle it is. So
Yeah.
it's like there's all these moving pieces where I don't necessarily think we can ever have like a definitive, like it has to be this number or within this range. But you know, the idea of that being generally a uniquely, very uniquely female from a biological sex standpoint experience, that's going to be one of them. And then the balance of estrogen and progesterones in your system is going to be something that, you know, because I don't think so, but I mean, men certainly have estrogen, but a significantly smaller amount of it. I have no idea if men have progesterones at all in their system. That's actually something I should ask my wife about.
Yeah.
But again, like these
Convert
very,
to testosterone.
what's that?
Or that progesterone can convert to testosterone, but I can't remember
Yeah,
the rest.
but in women, because you know, for
Yeah.
men, most of their testosterone is produced in their testicles, which
Yeah.
women biologically do not have. So yeah, I mean, the body seems to have different ways to produce these hormones in different amounts between the two sexes. But again, it's this sort of this idea of, you know, that's more typical, and then there is, you know, then there's the you know, the aesthetic aspect and how people respond to the aesthetic in terms of, say, long hair or feminine features, because obviously there are women who work out at the gym and they're low body fat and they have smaller breasts, and yet some people would never not mistake them for. So there's all these sort
Yeah.
of bits and pieces, but
Yeah.
my sense is it's like more in this direction means one woman, more in this direction means, you know, man,
Yeah.
male, and then somewhere in the middle, I guess maybe that's, you know, where the idea of aspiration might fit a bit more, because it's just like, you know, do you feel a call, you know, and what, where is that, you know?
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And part of it is like, if I feel like a woman, well, since most people say like, excuse me, ma'am, or, you know,
Mhm.
that kind of thing, or default to like, oh, is your husband home or whatever, kind of stuff, then it's
Yeah.
like, then I'm like, oh, well, culturally I've succeeded
Mhm.
at that. But then that's like, if it were just that, it could be fake, right? It could just be like, oh, I'm pretending to be this thing. And so I have this one layer, but not the underlying stuff. So the aspirational part is important for me specifically because I want to be like, okay, I want to feel that inner womanhood as well as the outer, and I want those to match. And
Mhm.
then, of course, my body, I want to match just as much as I can get it to
Mhm.
over.
Yeah. 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 So yeah, it sounds like, you know, we're sort of at this place. It's not a simple answer of what is a woman. It's all of these things. And well, perhaps, you know, and it's sort of a synthesis in them that gives like an essence of, rather than a cookie cut model of the ideal. And I think maybe that's part of the problem, you know, although maybe that's the question about aspiration, is somewhere for us.
Mhm.
And then the question is, you know, is that created culturally? I mean, I imagine it's reinforced culturally, but of course, we've seen over history how, you know, certainly the visual aspects of it in terms of body shape and, you know, sexual attractiveness, like that
Mhm.
changes over time. So again, there's that relevance that's sort of happening that creates, you know, this model to be more salient. Whereas, you know, if you plop yourself into a different time, that might not work for you.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Yep. That's why I'm kind of like wanting to build a model of gender that is like a little more broad than, these are the clothes, these are the careers that you can have or whatever,
Hmm.
but still has something available for people who want an aspirational model, because I think that does have to be somewhat linked to culture. But I think culture needs to be somewhat linked to neurobiology as well for it to be a fully functioning, like, yeah, that essential, machinery of gender, so to speak, rather than having an essential gender, one true model of gender out there or something, which neither
Hmm.
of us want, of course. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, that would involve like, more of a like what Greg and John and me were talking about a little bit, which is just kind of like having that salience landscaping in a woman geared more toward the relational fabric of the community, having the salience landscape of a man, defaulting at least to like problem solving.
Yep.
What Greg had before termed individual agentic, but John was kind of like, well, maybe let's call it problem solving. And then both main genders being able to flip those two
Hmm.
as needed in their mind, maybe to a greater or lesser extent. Like we all know guys and women who don't seem to be able to flip those very effectively, and some who seem to be very effective or seem to have crossed over the other way most of the time. Um,
Well, that actually raises maybe a bit of the question of sort of the necessity to separate gender from sex, not specifically because it's important to trans people in terms of assigned gender identity, but I
yeah,
wonder to a certain degree, and I'll use these terms. I'm not sure where they would fit sort of in your model, your idea of gender, but you sort of have a spectrum of, feminine on one side, which are a series of traits, one of which might be orienting towards the relational. Women are interested in people. And on the other end, you have masculine, interested in things, problem solving. You have, chaos over here, order over here, all sorts of these, perspectives that people have sort of taken to create this polarity in terms of masculine and feminine. But we all have women who tend to live more on the end of the masculine. And we
yeah,
have men who seem to orient a little bit more to the feminine, but they would never turn around and say they are a different gender than they are.
yeah,
So it's like,
yeah,
what's that about? If we think of sort of the aspiration, because even though they might not be actively aspiring in the case of the cis woman to be masculine, although we can talk about that a little bit later,
mhm,
um, there's probably a way in which like that's their orientation, that feels more natural, but was that programmed into them? And therefore, if they actually took a shift and tried to aspire more to the gender end that matches their sexual biology, are they actually better off? Would they actually actualize better because they are more, because they're more in line with, I guess, the underlying physiological differences that they have? So it just opens up sort of a whole can of worms and that question of aspiration.
yeah. And like I feel like we're so complex, and we have this human mind that can like, override one part of our brain with other parts of our brain and personality and conditioning and effort and that kind of all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
If like a woman has this maybe more relational mindset in the woman parts of her brain, the female parts of her brain, but then like other sections of her brain, this is oversimplifying as obviously a non-scientist,
Mm-hmm.
um, are like geared way more toward problem solving. Maybe she's like highly autistic or something, and she's like very much like into like engineering problems and not so much with like talking with people about their families and feelings and sitting at coffee shops like I like to do,
Mm-hmm.
and like having heart to hearts all the time.
Mm-hmm.
um, but then she might still feel like, well, this in her inner sense she might still feel like a woman,
Mm-hmm.
because her brain is telling her like, yeah, you're in the right, basically your sex is matching your gender,
Mm-hmm.
your performance is totally different.
Right, the egoic projection doesn't match up.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So
which
maybe they
is
could get in touch with that other side. I don't know.
yeah, but then that's sort of that element where it starts, not that we want to limit it to that, but you start to look at the I guess cultural emphasis or sort of definition of, I don't even know if it's about gender, right? But you sort of have these life experiences that you have that have oriented you in a particular way because maybe you just got rewarded for doing things. And when you tried to reach out to people, you felt rejected at an early age. So you just, you have a developmental trauma that's essentially there that sort of blocked off that that actualization of that part of your gender. It felt easier over in this other end, more rewarding, more dopamine, so it feels more right.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so you orient over there. But like you say, like inside internally, there might be a little bit of a piece and sort of matching up with the gender and the sexual assignment. So
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, just come back into like, yeah, it's like really complex. It's like, how do we sort these things out to sort of say like, this is the thing that, you know, where you should be looking into a transition, or this is the thing.
Right.
Yeah.
That's where I was being a little annoying with Greg one time when we were talking, and I was like, so could you say that everyone who defaulted to relational was a woman and everyone? And he was like, well, no, I wouldn't exactly go that far. And there's, further complexities and stuff. And I
Yeah.
was like, yeah, okay. Like, I mean, and I know it was an annoying question, but it's like that's like down the I want to at least there's more we can pinpoint as far as that goes, and more that we can also branch out from. Like I think it's a great framework to come from, just because
Mhm.
personally that was mine and many people's experiences. Like I always love the idea of like sitting and talking to people and going on walks and being like really about that like classic feminine archetype conversational, stuff. And,
Mhm.
like I noticed a lot of the guys that I work with in peer support, they want to be doing something and not looking at me. We want to be side by side and looking at something else, and,
Mhm.
working around an activity. And then they'll talk to me about their life in the process of doing that, and which also could be partly conditioning.
Mhm.
But yeah, there's got to be more, because we are so sophisticated. And then also there's such a compelling drive toward gender. Like it's such a strange thing.
Well, I want to ask you about that. So I'm gonna sort of skip ahead on what I thought we would talk about, but this sounds like a great time to sort of ask that question. Like, what's the use of the label of the category anyways? Because here we are
Mhm.
talking about like how complex it is, and you can't really put all these particular elements in here and say it's this thing, because there's
Yeah.
always, well, not everybody, a lot, yes, but not, it almost feels like part of the pain of trying to figure this out is because we actually have these categories, we have this binary
Mhm.
that we're sort of talking about and trying to further flesh out and identify. And it's like, there must be a reason, because you just sort of named, like there's some utility to
Mhm.
having the category, but it also feels a bit counterproductive in some ways of just letting people be if we don't have a prescription for them. Like if you have a
Yeah.
prescription, then yeah, of course. But if you don't have a prescription and we just want to sort of let people be and self-actualize, or, aspire to whatever it is that they want,
Mhm.
um, the
Yeah.
labels get in the way.
Yeah, it's such a good this is the sticking one of the big sticking points for me on multiple levels. Like one is the practical, and that's where I had talked with John and Greg about, living in that dynamic tension, what John would call tonos,
Mm-hmm.
between that cultural model of your gender and who you are, and playing with that, and like a lot of creative power coming out of that, not in obeying the cultural model, and not in obeying like, oh, I'm just going to be me authentically, but in between there, for someone who fits well enough in the system and wants to participate in it, to use that, like, I don't fit the ideal model of a woman in many ways, but nobody does. And so I can play with my individuality, and that's kind of fun. And we can, like, you know what I mean? Like come up with new versions of womaning in the process, like anyone would. Um, and then like ontologically, there's something that strikes me as important about gender, as nebulous as it is, because you have, again, like monkeys doing it. Like you have all these different primates like observing members of their pod who have the same genitalia and behaving like, learning to behave like them, not
Mm-hmm.
just behaving like them, but like actually learning the
Mm-hmm.
process of adulting, according to that. And it feels so deep and so deeply cultural for humans. Like I don't know any culture yet, I don't study anthropology, but that doesn't have gender. Like I say, like maybe modern Scandinavia is trying to get there or something, but like feels like it's not quite there.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously trans people feel a great compulsion to transition a lot of the time, and a lot of people seem to need a big divide between the gender, like bigger divide than there is between the genders. And I think that's because they're craving some sense of gender actualization, maybe aspirationally in themselves too. So I think
Mm.
there's like the practical level, how I fit in gender, and then there's like the ontological level. I think there's something pretty big there for us that is a thing, but hard to pin down. Um, that I don't want to let go of and just say, well, everyone aspire to whatever, be a firefighter, be a lawyer, or something, or be a
Mhm.
better person, be a more noble person or something.
Mhm.
Don't worry about gender, that would be a possibility, certainly. And I think I have friends who would want to do that. They don't want gender at all, in
Well,
their aspirational life.
yeah, and I mean, we sort of see that, with the emergence, at least for me, socially or culturally, the idea of sort of my non-binary, right? Like,
Mhm.
I don't really want to orient, or don't feel like I orient to one of those things, or I feel fluid, I can move between them. In which case,
Yeah, yeah. And it's like some of them want to sort of aspire, I think, toward both things.
mm,
They like want to be better men and better women,
hmm
and some want neither. And like you said, some just kind of are like, well, I'm just this fluid thing and I don't have to really. And like, I guess depending on how you define gender fluid, you could be introducing an aspirational goal there too, or not. I think most
mm,
don't when they go in that direction,
mm.
more like identity.
Yeah, so as you name all these things, what starts to happen in me is I start to bring in a developmental framework,
Mm,
because there's like something about like trying to hold all these things as just like there. It's like, no, I need to organize these, because this is too chaotic to just hold it as like these things exist. It's like,
yeah.
so sort of this idea of like, I like the idea of, gender being a developmental line, for anybody. Although I would almost wonder, to a certain degree, is it two separate lines that represent the binary, or is it just gender and you sort of start somewhere in the middle and maybe move up here? But the thing is, the implication is, if you want to grow your opposite, gender, that you would be taking away from the other one. So it's like I'm trying to like create a map for the idea of what's the aspiration on gender. I think it has to be separate, because and I wonder where that's limiting. I don't have an answer. I actually don't think it is. But again, like, just liking this idea of like so many things on it, of course it's very binary, but having sort of this spectrum. And of course I feel like anybody could move freely between it if they develop that capacity. But it seems almost like, you have to have separate lines for the feminine and the masculine,
Mm,
just to use that term, rather than the complexity of trying to say assigned gender, and or
yeah.
sex and stuff like that. My head starts to hurt sometimes as I try to hold those as separate things. Like, I get they're separate, but to talk about them, it's exhausting. So
Totally.
I like the idea of sort of the more of the energetic thing. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, there's just something about trying to hold those pieces, because for me, my question about what's the use of labels or categories almost occurs to me as a higher developmental idea. The idea that you can let go of the boundary that defines you and move more into self-actualization, or into self-transformation,
Mm-hmm.
away from the constraints of culture that are sort of imposed on people implicitly and explicitly.
Yeah.
So I sort of, that feels important, such that in some ways, earlier life, it makes more sense to me, holding the developmental framework, to
Yeah.
have, there's a real usefulness to gender, to
Mm,
help guide people, although we have to not be rigid about it, I think, in a certain way, but to guide people more in alignment with where we might expect them to go, but without the actual, iron door,
mm,
like they have the opportunity to make that shift. That
yeah.
seems important, like at that age, to sort of do that sort of more narrow actualization into the gender, and especially on the social end, because children are always looking to others to affirm their behavior, to
Yeah.
be accepted, to be included, that socialized mind piece.
Sure.
Um, but then I wonder about the utility of, as we have the social or cultural conversation around this, should we be letting that go a little bit more? I mean, yes, not everybody, just because you're an adult, is developmentally at a stage where they can sort of hold that perspective. But I do sort of wonder about the rigidity what I perceive as the rigidity of it, and then trying to have these conversations and fit people into this binary when, like we're talking about it, like it seems really difficult to do. It seems really, and yet there's an essence, right? Like you say,
Mhm.
you're still on the journey, but to me, you're a woman. Well, what the fuck do I mean by that? I don't know what I mean by that. And to try to like tease it out, it just makes my head hurt. It's like, oh my God, it's so exhausting. Like, can't it just be that thing?
Yeah, it's aporia. Getting
Yeah.
to that point for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting to me. I reflect on how like the journey has become more spiritual in nature as it's progressed, and that's not to say that I don't need to get my shit together on a material level, which I definitely do, but
Hmm.
that like my my personal aspirational model of gender was based on Michael Lafargue's book, which was oh geez, Rational Spirituality and Divine Virtue in Plato, it's
Hmm.
called. And it was like basically how you identify your own Platonic virtue forms to basically aspire toward, to model
Hmm.
your life after,
Hmm.
which are living virtue forms. Once you identify them, they're not conceptual. They're made from concepts, but then they, like a bolt of lightning shoots through them at a certain stage in your like working with one, like a koan almost in Zen,
Hmm.
like question, and then suddenly it's like bam, it
Right.
explodes. Like your whole life is different.
Hmm.
That's what it feels like.
Hmm.
So I did that with womanhood for myself, and that became a much more powerful North Star than like any cultural, like narrow cultural construct for me, because it was alive. It was like I felt it in my body, like it hit me in my heart and down lower and other places in my body. And I was just like, whoa, this is really
Hmm.
something transformative in its potential. And I'm kind of like, well, if you're older and if you want to use gender, you know, aspirationally, maybe that's where you go with it,
Hmm.
and maybe you don't. Maybe that's like not, I'm totally like, I want to keep space for people who just don't really feel that strongly about gender,
Hmm.
like yourself, and other people.
Hmm.
I know, but like for me, that was like, oh, I can now. I'm like, I've got Athena. I'm putting on my makeup, and I'm like thinking about the owl goddess, and you know what I mean, like all this stuff that I kind of have really taken to.
Hmm.
Maybe it's filling in those back layers that I didn't get developmentally as well. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know because I've shared before with you sort of my experience of growing up and what I thought the social cultural messaging was against what it meant to be a man and masculinity, and how I really didn't take on that identity. Like I knew that I was that thing, but it's never seemed to be any part of my active way in which I needed people to see me. I mean, I'm sure if somebody had misgendered me, that would probably make it very relevant and salient to me, and then I'd be a bit weirded out by that, and I'd be trying to correct it so that I fit in socially the way that I thought that I should. But sort of noticing as I did more developmental work and started working with people, in the stuff that you and I have done in sort of the authentic relating and the circling area, starting to sort of notice the patterns, typically, obviously, everybody's different, there's nuance, but noticing sort of the patterns and noticing for me in some ways, like I just really wasn't leaning in any particular way, like I had parts about me that, that I think were, would be stereotypically feminine that felt fine and okay to me, and but I never felt that I gravitated to them, and I had these masculine parts that I wasn't really allowing myself to gravitate to. So sort of the idea of having the idea of when polarity sort of came into my awareness, looking at David Data's work, the way of the superior man, various complications aside with how it's written, in some way in there, it's not specifically necessarily aspirational for masculinity, because there's a lot of talk more about polarity being the importance, and
Mhm.
not just that men have to be masculine and women have to be feminine. The idea is in a relationship, if you don't have polarity, you've got flatness, and
Mhm.
therefore there's not a lot of life force. It's a lot of draining. And so I noticed sort of after reading that, I found myself leaning more into what was more stereotypically masculine, and starting to sort of take more of that on, like accepting the evolutionary biology aspect of it, of like maybe that's I'm going to feel better, or I'm going to be better, or I'm going to maximize my potential if I lean more into this particular direction. And I
Yeah.
would like to think that I realize that is true. Like, I think I feel much more okay, even though I don't go around talking about how masculine I am. It it actually feels a little bit more like something where I could say, like, if I had a hat and a list of things on identity, I would probably put male on there in a way in which I identify it, rather than in a way in which I just cognitively am aware of it because of my biology. So that
Mhm.
sort of occurs to me that maybe I went through, or maybe still going through, and sort of leaning into that aspirational side of masculinity, as a cis person, and
Yeah.
getting the sense that I'm probably living a bit of a better life now. Not that I could ever identify anything was wrong, but I
Yeah.
just knew that, like, it don't seem to fit. Like, what's going on here? Why are
Wow.
these guys talking about what it's like to be male, and these women are over here constantly talking about what it's like to be female? And I'm like, I don't want to talk about either of these things because they weren't
Uh,
relevant to me. But as I lean
yeah.
into it, I feel, I don't know.
What do you think the difference? Yeah, what is that feeling or that
Well,
shift?
what do you mean, the feeling? The feeling of,
Like you feel like your life is better, maybe, and like can you kind of elaborate on that at all, or is it like too
yeah.
nebulous or?
Well, I guess, I mean, I'm certainly on the edge of my think. I haven't really thought about it, but I would probably say almost like a structure has been sort of created for me, almost like there's a boundary, like the boundaries. This is what matters, and I think I shared this with you before. And I think I'm like playing more full out in that.
Yeah.
So there's more, yes, there's some of that, like, I think I went through sort of a Gnostic, transformation in fairly subtle ways, but yet important ways. It's not like suddenly I had a hairless chest and then I grew hair on my chest. It's nothing quite like that. Always been very hairy, so that part never changed. But
Mhm.
um, I get the sense it's probably this thing that you're talking about, in terms of actualization, that I have a frame in my mind, whether it's society's frame or not, of what that means, or moreness and
Mm.
suchness of masculinity. And I
Mm.
feel like that's being more and more integrated, whatever that idea is.
Wow.
So I guess, it's an aspiration, but I guess it feels like a realization, like, and it's a different kind of okayness of like not feeling bothered that I wasn't identifying as male,
Mm.
in a particular way. Now it's almost like there's more of a pleasantness to it. I don't know what the word is. There's just a moreness and a suchness, I think,
Mhm.
is probably the best I can explain it right now.
That was so cool. Thank you. I mean, that like mirrors my experience so well. Like that,
Hmm.
with a little verbal tweaking, that could be like a transgender person's story about themselves, right? Like in
Yeah.
cases, like,
Yeah, and that's what I like about you naming gender, as an aspirational thing, because I actually think it's a way in which we can get away from the complexity of the cultural and social, implications around trans and transitioning, and just looking at it as a thing that we all share. If we can look at it, and then it makes, to me, the idea is it will make it easier for people to empathize for people who are making the transition, especially if it's medical, and and therefore, like, okay, well, let's put money into the studies so that we make sure that we're
mm,
doing the best thing and doing right by these people. And I just generally think that's kind of what's needed for people to come together and properly support. They need to find that part in themselves,
wow.
whatever that is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, that's just beautiful. Like I keep thinking of this John Frusciante quote. He was a musician, he is a musician, and it's limitations are set, only then can we go all the way.
Hmm. Yeah, when we know the boundaries, we can play full out in it.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Almost like it gives me a level of meaning and hearing you talk like gender as a social construct, like leaning into parts of that, at least for me, it's like more than I'm participating, right? Like I have this sense of connectedness to something larger than myself, as
Hmm.
John Vervaeke would say,
Hmm.
and it's maybe not personal happiness per se, but it's more satisfying and fulfilling on a level too. Like when I go out and like I smile at people, you know what I mean? And it's like, it just feels right, so right for me to be
Mhm.
that kind of person, that like typical femme person. Um, you know, it's not making me happy, and that's in the sense of like it doesn't give me food, or you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like I don't get a chocolate bar every time I do that or anything. It just
Mm.
feels good.
Yeah, like nourishes your soul in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Mhm. Mm.
That's great.
Mm.
I've been wanting to talk to like more cis guys, especially about that, because I feel like that's a missing piece when I talk to a lot of cis guys like John about the theory or whatever, but just like the experiential part of it, and like someone who's gone through this journey like very consciously, like yourself.
Mhm.
Really cool.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I like the connective tissue that's here. The similarities, you know,
Yeah.
again, that human experience, but one that I guess we don't tend to talk about from the default position, you know. It's just taken for granted in
Yeah,
some
it's taken for granted, and we don't know what gender is, but we pretend we do, and then
Mm.
breaks down, you know, as soon as like our worldview starts to get too shaky for it to exist. And like in order to reclaim it, we have to live it, embody it.
Mhm.
And you know, I think that's where all this developmental work that people do in other areas hopefully can be brought to bear more on gender.
Well, but it also has me wonder if this loss of it, this loss of this aspiration to gender, because there's been the relaxation of the rules, or the idea of like forcing pigeonholing people into it, or you know, and I get like that rigidity culturally is problematic, but then what problem do we create when we sort of open that up? And you know, for me, I draw parallels to obviously my experience in terms of sort of the demonization of like masculine traits equals toxicity, you know,
Mhm.
because of the amplification of them, and therefore, you know, men tend to shy away from them. And we see a huge cultural shift, at least in terms of males, you know, the boys not doing as well now in university, and women are, because culturally there's been such a focus on women. And yet we also see, or at least I think we see, women also being deeply dissatisfied too. And I sort of get the sense, is that because they've been chasing and trying to fit to the male mold of I can do, you know, that feminist sort of perspective, like anything a man can do, I can do. And it's like, well, okay, great. But that's, you know, you're now aspiring in some way to the masculine or the male end of things, and you're in some ways sort of abandoning the more feminine evolutionary biology part, so you're sort of working against your
Right.
nature for some people, right? And
Yeah.
again, I don't want to
Yeah.
force everybody, just because you were born female you need to act female, but it's that idea that socially it's like, well, you can have it all, girl, you can be a CEO and you can have kids, and it's just like,
Yeah. And what good
not
what
really. And it's not to be down on it. I just don't think you can actualize being a CEO fully, as well as being a parent. Like that
mm,
idea of really being a parent, because of, you know, there's just the realities of what mother means to a child that just isn't there uh, typically for fathers.
mhm.
So you know, and so then you have, you know, I mean, you know, if you pay any attention on the dating side, I don't, and I don't imagine you do, because you're in a relationship. You're married, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so we're both married. However, certainly enough social media, we sort of get an idea of what's going on out there, and women seem to be struggling to find men, or masculine men, because I think men have been told to be less that, and you actually have this hyper masculinity in some ways that's starting to be um which would be a terrible aspiration. I'm thinking of like this Andrew Tate guy that's sort of taken off on social media, and it's just like, it's really easy to just focus on him and look at all the bad, and I don't see anything but bad. But I'm sure a number of the people who are following him are overcorrecting in some ways of like, yeah, we need more of this, you know. And it's like, yep, yeah, the guy's a bit of a dick. So
I
it's like, can
know.
we just find something that's a little cleaner, a little healthier, sort of? But there just seems to be less.
Yeah.
My perception is less of it, and we're seeing this represented in various ways. So it's this question of, have we culturally sort of been reinforcing a movement away from your assigned sex, and actualizing that particular gender. For some people, that needs to happen. Like
Mhm.
yourself, I think that needs to happen. And for others, I think they're sort of caught up in the, you know, take over the world, women are
Yeah.
going to rule the world. And it's like, but is
Mhm.
that, you really just want to take the place of the men and do the same thing that the men are
Yeah.
doing? That doesn't make sense to me.
Does not make sense to me either. And it's always been a critique of like, I guess, second wave feminism, as it's called,
Mhm.
for me, is just like women in business suits now becoming the CEO or whatever. Which is like, if a woman wants to do that, like fine, like that's
Yeah,
awesome. Like,
totally.
go do it, but yeah, it could come with a downside, especially like the familial side, like you said, like you might have to think like what do I really want the most here? Instead of trying to have it all. And also like, yeah, like ruling the world, like I'm thinking of like Fannie Norland, who was on Greg's You Talking with Greg podcast a while ago. She is some kind of business consultant. I think it's somewhere in Scandinavia, but she kind of looks at like, her version of like a female-led company, but it's more like, and this is kind of going off into one specific direction. I don't want to, pigeonhole my views into this, but it's interesting, that like the men are like there to kind of protect and make space for the women, and then the women like are this like generative creative thing or whatever. um and like she kind of, that's probably a terrible rendition because it's been years since I've at least a year since I've heard this, I think, and this is occurring to me now, but like I guess what I'm trying to say is like the way that a woman would like rule the world and would be different maybe
Sure.
than a man would rule the world, and they could each do their thing, but it doesn't, yeah, like doesn't have to be that stereotypical toxic masculinity for women and men now. Great.
Yeah, yeah, and that's where I have some empathy for the idea of sort of there being a patriarchy that sort of pigeonholes women, that they have to show up in a particular way in those roles to be successful. So I see the problem of that. Um, and I still sort of worry about sort of this idea of this social, again, another sort of idea of social contagion of, you can do all these things, but you're not really sitting back and wondering, should you? You're just sort of going along with, well, that's what everybody else around me is doing. So I guess I need to turn around and get a finance degree so that I can make a lot of money, because all my female friends are saying they don't ever want to rely on a man, and
Yeah.
we can flip this just as easily as sort of the idea of the benefit of partnership, and how, in marriage, and how that can be greater than the sum of its parts, like that you come together, actualize, obviously there's a big emphasis on parenting, but it's also just on shared responsibility and affording more than you can sort of get on your own. But there's sort of been this, again, sort of this orientation or push of like, don't be dependent on men because that's what makes you strong. And it's just like, well,
Mhm.
don't be dependent on anybody. This is probably
Yeah.
not a necessarily healthy thing to do, but this idea of like, I need to move away from this other thing socially because this is what other people are suggesting is the new black, and all the problems that it sort of tends to illuminate. And I wonder if I'm pretty sure we're experiencing the pains of that.
That makes sense.
Which is why I have a lot of empathy and also orientation, and pay a lot of attention on the evolutionary biology sort of side of things. Of like, there's
Mhm.
wisdom baked into our cells somewhere here, that this matters. And
Yeah.
yes, you may have grown up a certain way, or at a certain stage of gestation something shifted for you. We don't necessarily know. And you end up a more complex individual than a lot of other people.
Mhm.
So what can we do to help those people identify that? But also, you know can we just let you know girls be girls? Can we just let boys be boys? Whatever we necessarily mean by that, rather than
Oh,
the social, you should, the rules, and when we do
yeah.
that and we sort of let that stuff go, um, I think this is
Mm. That's
kind of Jordan Peterson's ultimate orientation of like sort of identifying like, hey, this is all an experiment, and we all think it's settled. we don't realize how much is still an experiment, how in the grand scheme of human history, we're still talking about a really tiny piece of it. We're still trying to figure our way out, and then we create laws around it and everything else. And it's just like, ooh.
Yeah.
Anyways, it's leaking into the sort of the culture side of things, but
Yeah, it kind of brushes up there, though. I mean, from I don't know if what her political views are, but Darcia Narvaez, um, who wrote a book called she co-wrote it, Restoring the Kinship Worldview. It's seemingly different from Peterson because it talks about gender fluidity and sexual fluidity being like more common in indigenous societies and things like that.
mhm,
Um, but she's also like, yeah, we're really experimenting wildly with the idea that a kid just gets raised by maybe one person, maybe they get put in daycare really quickly, like in most indigenous cultures, it would have been, I think she was saying like three people. This was on Henriquez's podcast also.
mhm,
Um, but three people until age 7 would raise a kid, and it would be like mom, dad, and grandma, and mom would have a really primary role, and that kind of thing.
mhm,
So I think we're seeing that converging,
mhm,
from a lot of people in the sense making world. Um, it is a hard conversation to have because it butts up against our ideals of individual freedom, right? And like self-actualization being like only for the self and don't depend on anyone and don't depend on that guy and
mhm,
kind of thing, for a woman specifically. But
mhm.
it does make a lot of sense to me. Like, I don't know if I'd been born cis, would I just like be sitting here with like 5 kids right now and like staying at home and be totally happy? Like, part of me thinks, yeah, like that's where my heart would be. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. Maybe I'd want to be a CEO or something.
Mhm.
Unlikely, but
Yeah, yeah, and again, I don't think either of us are saying there's anything wrong with any decision that somebody takes. It's sort of that question of like the influence the society has to help us sort of deceive ourselves or gaslight ourselves,
Mhm.
for us to, we don't seem to have that tendency to look, a lot of us, not all of us, to look deeper and really get Socratic about the choices that we're making. Like, why am I doing this? And then sort of doing that serious play, because there's some existential ignorance here, but do that serious play and sort of lean into like, oh, what would it be like if I just sort of put all that down for a minute? Then what do
Mhm.
I orient around? Sort of
Mm.
that general question of
Yeah.
how do we self actualize? How, what really is identity?
Cool.
Um,
Mm. Yeah. I mean, yeah, this sounds like really, really fecund. Like we could have like rituals based around those things in culture. Like there's obviously the coming of age ritual that was like classic, but
mhm.
the other ones that say like, well, now you abandon your gender, a ritual for that. Like what would
Yeah,
you do without that?
yeah.
Whew.
But I love the idea of us, again, I guess moving away from the binary of it. Although I think there's usefulness in the binary because we see it biologically,
Mhm.
so there's something that's sort of baked in. But that idea of like, just more, I guess, feel myself cringing on the inside if about to use this term, but more inclusive, but I don't want it. My distinction on inclusive is like, I don't want to bring somebody into an existing or traditional frame and include them in that. I want them
Mhm.
to have the freedom to create their own category, to create their own label, because there are distinctions. I mean, there's even distinctions within the traditional ones, but we seem to be okay with them and we're not fighting about it.
Mhm.
So it's just like, can we just like,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I know the numbers are not there, but my fantasy is like, so we just have, two new categories in sport, and that's trans men, trans women,
Mhm.
and I get why some people really reject that idea, but for me, that's like, that's fair. That's as fair as we can get in the simplicity of when we were saying the division between gender for sport is fair, because even within that you have such variation. But certain sports like boxing, they do it by weight class, right? So you've got men's boxing, women's boxing, and then you have weight class, because that's what's relevant to sort of narrow those things down. So I have this fantasy that we just sort of do that, but that we can sort of welcome it. I mean, I get
Mm.
Everybody's going to turn around and go to the trans NBA or whatever because, WNBA suffers enough as it is. But
Yeah.
I like the idea of like that's a place for people to play it. And that's, that sort of mirrors what seems to be a little bit more fair. I mean, again, there's still that categorization issue, so maybe we could just drop gender in general and we could just look at more biological markers, in terms of like bone density and heart size and,
Mhm.
so you end up with like 10 levels, or some
Yeah.
ridiculousness like that,
Like it's like that girl in somewhere in the United States who won state wrestling high school champions. She like became the state champion last year in wrestling and she beat all the boys to do this. It's like, well, she probably has the biomarkers to match, partly could be skill, obviously, and determination and all that stuff. But, she looked pretty brutal to me. Like, oh,
Wow. Yeah. I never caught that one. Yeah. I know some curious about it just because of generally there's absolutely no competition in certain sport at whatsoever.
yeah. Yeah. Like it's really rare. But I'm like, if she passes those like bone density, muscle mass, whatever. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
didn't even have to because it was fine. But like I guess if a boy had like very limited muscle mass and bone density, then he could play with the girls. Maybe in
Yeah.
that thing if it worked out that way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's gets so tricky.
It
It's
does.
yeah. Like, are we ever going to do that? But that again brings me back to like, how helpful are these categories, and then we want to add new categories. And I like the idea of it because that means everybody's sort of included. Although, as we drill them down, this is my problem with identity politics, and you have the different differentiations. I'm trying to forget different intersectionalities. And it's just like for under a certain culture of perpetrator and victim culture that we sort of have,
Hmm.
in somebody's ideal world, you have 1,000 different categories, and that's just combinatorially explosive. We can't. That's not sustainable, So
Yeah.
somebody's always going to sort of feel left out.
Yeah. Yeah. That's like the thing that I'm butting up against is like there's gonna be plenty of people who are not gonna be satisfied with like our version of, versions of gender because it won't include, demi boys as a specific category or, gray ace demi girls or something. You know what I mean? Like sexuality
And
gender
I'm
combination.
right back to get rid of the labels and the categories. That's way too complex.
It gets out of control
It
for sure.
does. How, and I don't know what the answer to that is to sort of solve that problem,
Yeah.
because somewhere there's going to be outliers somewhere that aren't going to get included. I mean, I would love the idea that we could just have a social shift and look at things differently and just say like, hey, we're doing our best. Hey, this is an experiment. Like, can we all just agree like we're trying to do our best, and let's, put a certain amount of attention and energy and funding into social evolution rather than social dogmatic ideological positions.
Wow. Cool.
Can we do that to make these 3-degree turns over a period of time such that at least, if you know that you're on the outside in terms of the sport end, you don't feel like you've been completely excluded everywhere else culturally or socially. It's like, oh, actually, there's a place for me over here. There's a place for me over here. But when it comes to the physical part, I'm just a unique individual.
Hmm.
This thing that we're told to celebrate, but then for some people, it's like, no, but I need to be included. Well, we just don't know how to do that. You'll be wrestling yourself.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Like, um, a person who I was talking to, I don't want to get them in trouble, but I think this is a good idea that they had was like maybe, like there's going to be a downside to being in these outer categories or whatever, but maybe there's upsides too. Like I feel like trans people we have an interesting ability to like look at gender, like having like, especially if we've lived one way and then another, we can kind of like reflect back on culture. Like this is how I
Mhm,
was treated as a man. This is how I'm treated as a woman. Isn't that
mhm,
interesting?
mhm, mhm,
Um, like there are pluses to it and then there are drawbacks. Like I definitely am not joining any competitive sports teams. Like I don't want to, like I feel like the science isn't there, etc. Like and I'm just kind of like, you know what, that's life.
mhm,
um there,
mhm.
total equality.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think there's something really important in that. That's life. We seem to have sort of forgotten that struggle, discomfort is a part of our human experience. Sometimes we're going to feel left out. And I get that we don't want to systemically do that because that leads to, generational trauma. But we just sometimes gonna have that experience like, I don't fit in, like I like the idea of me being an awesome guitar player, but the reality is that I know that I'm not willing to do the work.
Yeah.
So it's just like I don't have the expectation I should be able to stand on stage, play air guitar, and have it come out sound perfectly, and me to feel like I've earned that in some way.
Yeah, yeah, right. That's I think maybe it was to you I mentioned the Kurt Vonnegut story, Harrison Bergeron, where everyone was now equal in the future. It's a short story that Kurt Vonnegut did, and he was like, the year is 20 whatever, and everyone was finally equal, but it was because like a smart person had a little electrode in his brain that would like disrupt his thoughts every 30 seconds to make him just as smart as everyone else, and
Right.
like that kind
Yeah.
of thing. Like
Yeah.
as
Careful what you wish for.
yeah, it's absurd, but it points out, yeah, it's like wishing for one virtue at the exclusion of all others for one thing, and just
Hmm.
yeah, ignoring life as it's and just taking it in as an individual, and this is my experience, and yeah, transitioning is fucking hard. Like it's expensive, it hurts, it's long, blah blah blah. And do I wish there were like like could I get a $5,000 like surplus from the government? Sure, I would take it,
Hmm.
but I'm not.
Hmm.
I don't know. There's a limit though. Whatever we end up deciding, like you can't make it completely flat. And I
Hmm.
would want to. Like that's part of the richness, the struggle, the like non-binary people. Well, this is what my friend was saying, is that, maybe non-binary people are in this specific shaman role in a lot of traditional societies. So maybe that's how they fit into our society, but that's going to be always a challenge for them. Like they won't get the benefits of either big gender, but they'll be uniquely able to do certain things and have certain roles that they fill. This is like, just a proposition.
Hmm. Well, I like that. It sort of suggests that those people, in terms of the developmental lines, have moved up on the masculine and on the feminine side, so that they're able to hold more of a perspective of what it's like to be this or that. Whereas if you have somebody who just, born male and they just aspirationally go for male, and obviously that line's going to be a lot higher, but their feminine side is going to be a lot more diminished, so it's going to be hard for them to more relate. So it almost implies that people who have although I do wonder to which degree they actually actualize their birth sex gender, but it does call into question that some are probably more likely to have a better idea of holding these sort of perspectives because they've lived as, at least socially and at least what's been projected on them, a particular way. So they do have some lived experience. And then they have this other one. I mean, it's going to be, again, it's going to be different, just like everybody's is, because one, they're trying to actualize something that culture might be pushing back on, depending
Mhm.
on the extents that they're willing to go to turn around and actualize this, at least on the physiological, biological side of things. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's sort of this idea that they might be more whole, or at least some can be more whole because they can hold more of that gender perspective, both energies.
Yeah, it's just so interesting to think about. Like, are they like enabling collective relevance realization by
Hmm.
that middle whole perspective, and then everyone's playing their part in that,
Hmm.
getting more depth perception on different issues and taking action in different ways, but they're like able to kind of mitigate maybe between the two sides or hold the wholeness and kind of look at all of society. I don't know, it's
Sure. Well, I mean, I would imagine there's certainly more. Well, there's the potential for more empathy to be there. It doesn't necessarily mean that's there because, as I was saying to you before, some people who would transition, I imagine, would wholly reject the other part because they're I would call it more of a grasping
yeah.
for the other gender. That it's just like we say sometimes to say what something is, we have to say what it's not. And if you
Hmm.
say like I'm not a male, I'm not a man, you actually push it back into shadow to a
Yeah.
certain degree, right? Like as you're trying to grasp for that, because if you've thrown this away, you can only be more of this other thing. And I'm sure some people have sort of whether they're trans or even cis have sort of done that, and they're ignoring more of sort of the subtle reality of their actual experience, because they're pushing that part into shadow and they really aren't integrating it.
Yeah, we can't really have a good aspirational model or archetype or anything based on that, right? Just like rejecting a part of ourselves, and that is more likely, given the culture wars climate, for people, of a non-binary bent to reject the masculine side. I would
Mm-hmm.
imagine also the feminine side too, but there is definitely going to be like an anti-patriarchy, anti-colonial,
Mm-hmm.
etc. thing that goes in there in the United States, at least,
Mm-hmm.
especially.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so we can't really build a balanced,
Hmm.
so-called balanced archetype or ideal for non-binary people either.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's hard. We could do it, but it's wobbly. The ladder is wobbly right now.
Well, there's something about this that I hadn't necessarily considered. And I actually, I think this is another reason why I have such a difficulty, with the culture war behavior, because it really is putting a lot of things into shadow. It's so
Mhm.
much disassociating, disidentification. Um, and I think that's part of it, is like, I wasn't able to, I'll work on this a bit more because this is sort of my edge of thinking, but it's like, I know there's something wrong with it, but I don't have the language for it. I'm like, oh, that doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem right. And I think maybe this is it. It's like, yeah, when you're rejecting so wholeheartedly this other thing for whatever your reason is, you've got a grasp, or socially you're being pressured to do it, whatever that is, you're putting that into shadow. Like, and that I would hope we would agree is a problem.
Yeah, yeah. No, I can attest to that even personally. I mean, theoretically, yes, for sure, but
Mhm.
personally, like when I started the whole self evaluation of gender, I guess, like I more identified with non-binary terms.
Mhm.
Like bi-gender was a big one for me. It like clicked somehow. Like I felt
Mhm.
seen when I found that term, so that was useful to a point. And then I was like, well, but the female gender seems bigger in me. Like that was more
Mm.
inner, more compelling, more larger.
Mhm.
Is the male side real, or is it a cultural accumulation?
Mhm.
Kind of like, and then I bounced really toward female, and then I was like, oh, but I'm like, there's some part of me that's really like, it's friction still developing here, and I
Mm.
had to kind of come back and like accept that there is like more of a masculine side. And so like I'm like
Mhm.
I'm somewhere in the 2/3 female brained category. I think that's my best, if I had to guess what the number was,
Mhm.
6 and 2/3% female brain. And that was close enough for me to be like woman, and that's what I want to go for. But I need to accept inwardly, at least, that there's part of me that is like this dude, which, for me is like, yeah, the kind of like the stupid humor, rambunctious, silly, you know what I mean? Like roughhousing
Mhm.
part of me, which obviously not everyone who's a dude,
Yeah.
but, like that is how it really clicks inwardly with me. Like I
Mm.
connect to that on a level. So I'm like, oh, okay, I can't just, you know what I mean? And we will get pressured, like trans women, definitely, oh, we all need lash extensions now. We all need, you know,
Right.
give up anything physical and just be super frilly.
Right. Right. Yeah. I like what it sounds like is you're sort of being really Socratic with yourself, and then moving into sort of that serious play as you sort of tried to, figure this out for yourself, is sort of what I'm taking away from that.
Yeah, you'll like this. My final project for transition, I decided, well, I'm calling it this, but it's to be a drag king, to do a drag king show with like a jean jacket and doing Motley Crue, you
Oh.
know, songs or Def Leppard songs or whatever that I grew up with, and kind of like bringing back in like full masculine energy as much as I can do it, and just like have fun with that as like a
Oh.
ritual serious play practice, like,
That
or
sounds
enjoy.
useful. It sounds really useful. And also, for some reason, for me, maybe it's just because you're smiling, like super entertaining. This part of me is like, oh, I want to be around for that.
Oh yeah, maybe I'll videotape. Well, partly I'm smiling because my name is gonna be Whiskey Dick for it, which I just enjoy. But yeah, the whole thing just will be super fun, I think. And I can feel in myself, I'm not ready. I can feel this like, "Oh, like don't do that, yet. I'm not there, but I
Mhm.
feel like there is an aspirational goal in there somewhere.
I like that. Um, so I wanted to because we're running we're just at our time, but I wanted to ask you to maybe share a few things. You mentioned at the beginning that you're writing a book on gender. I wonder if you can maybe say a few things about that, like
Yeah,
what's
I'd love
spurred
to.
it. I mean, I can imagine, but what spurred it, and sort of maybe orientation or your take, or what you hope the outcome will be from writing it.
Yeah, this one what came about when I was posting on social media and email, and people kept saying, "When are you writing your book?" Like, I was posting about gender and my thoughts on it, and it was like people who are trans, but a lot of people who are like therapists or just general public that were interested in it. And I was like, well, eventually maybe I should, and maybe I should write the book that I would have wanted at the beginning of my whole self questioning process. To,
Mm.
what I am
Hmm.
the entirety of what I can become, and my potential is not my actuality. And there's this big existential mystery at the heart of it all, and we need to like honor that through the process. And maybe some practical ways. I'm not a super practical person, as you know, or at least you probably have gleaned. It's going to be more theoretical, like philosophical,
Hmm.
than like any like pragmatic level stuff. But like, I think that is really needed right now. We need that side in for transitioning people, for
Hmm.
people who are thinking about it, for people who just kind of are curious about it, want to support someone, are a therapist or other, mental health professional, etc. um, to have a view of this that I now feel like, especially after talking with like John and Greg on the science level, and people like you on like just interpersonal sense making level, which
Hmm.
is also super important, but
Hmm.
um, like a model that works better, that is more
Mm.
accurate in terms of like gender, whatever gender is, we're closer to it than most people are. And also like this can afford people a better aspirational route as well. So that's book one. And if that goes well, we'll see. This is probably way too ridiculous. But then I'd like to move into like gender as a whole, like trying to get better at like, anthropologically, cross-culturally, and neurobiologically, et cetera, like start to understand it. Like we said earlier in this talk, like what's that next layer? If it's, if
Hmm.
men can also foreground the relational and women can foreground the problematic,
Hmm.
then like let's complexify. There's still work to be done. So that would be my long-term hope.
Totally, totally. I love that. I love the idea. What I'm hearing is writing something that you could have used,
Yeah.
like that like talking back to that older version of yourself.
Yeah.
And I just love it when people sort of do that. I feel like that's the sort of things that, especially as you gain more and more clarity, it's like that's the thing to sort of offer people when they're searching. And I can imagine you'll bring a lot of complexity and rigor to it too. So there's that way in which I trust, and it's like, oh, I look forward to being able to recommend your book under this intention, because that's what I would want people who have this question for themselves, cis or trans, this idea of gender, like, who am I? Am I a male or female? Whatever you end up calling it, here's a
Yeah.
book to like actually help internalize these questions.
Yeah. Yeah. If we can kind of know like what are we even talking about when we're asking these questions, I think that'll help.
Yeah, I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. This was enjoyable. I've got like a high vibrating sort of giddy sort of energy. It's going to take a little while to settle down from this and figure out what's next.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have, yeah, a lot of gratitude, and I just feel like for some reason this talk feels like full circle from like a bunch of the talks that I've done with you and other people. Like this feels like bringing it home. So
Yeah.
satisfying. I'll probably
Yeah.
also bounce around the house for a while afterward, but
Nice.
underneath that, there's a satisfaction I'm feeling.
Nice. Nice.